We're joined by USF professor, Dr. Kersuze Simeon-Jones, for a talk on one of our current special exhibition artists, Aimé Césaire. Before we get to the talk, though, please join me in thanking the city of St. Petersburg for their continued sponsorship of our educational programming, including lectures like these. In addition, we offer a special thanks to all of our members who make events like this possible. Please visit our website, thedali.org, for more information about online activities and programming, including these upcoming events, which apparently this slide decided it would unformat itself. But no worries, because guess what? I can read it for you. Tomorrow, you can join us for our film club, which this week is focusing on the US versus Billie Holiday, led by our own Joy Garrett Douglas. And then at 7 p.m., please join us for our video podcast, Follow the Tangent, Art, Archives, and Anecdotes, where we're going to be talking with this semester's Dalí Research Fellow from our library, Miguel Escribano. Very interesting. And then on Veterans Day, please join us for a slate of events to celebrate this occasion, including a special lecture by Curator of Education, Peter Tush, The Faces of War. And then at 6 p.m., poetry at the Dalí. On the 18th, we'll have a special performance by the St. Pete Sax Quartet, which is focusing on women composers and singers and their music. And then finally, as we are moving very quickly, God forbid I say it, towards Christmas and the holiday season, in general, Museum Store Sunday is going to be happening on the 28th for everyone's holiday shopping pleasure. I'm not sure I call it a pleasure. It's too early, right? Way too early for me. And then, of course, please always be sure to follow us on social media for the latest Dalí Museum happenings and Dalí-inspired conversations. And if you feel so moved, either after this talk or during or after any of our programming, be sure to share your thoughts on our Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter accounts, #TheDalí. So, it's my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Simeon-Jones. She is an associate professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at the University of South Florida. She received her PhD in Interdisciplinary Studies, the focus on history and literature of the Black diaspora, from the University of Miami. She completed her BA and MA in French literature and philosophy and Francophone studies at Rutgers University, with a minor in Spanish language and literature. Her research and teaching interests include intellectual history and sociopolitical movements of the African diaspora, Haiti's national history, and women's history within the African Black diaspora. She's published numerous articles, monographs, book chapters, and encyclopedic entries. Today, we're honored to have her join us to present the talk, Aimé Césaire, From Cahier to a Season in Congo and Beyond. Join me in welcoming Dr. Simeon-Jones.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's really a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start the talk by talking a little bit on my encounter with Aimé Césaire. I was fortunate enough to meet him, and to me, he is one of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century. And to have had the opportunity to meet him in person is an experience I will always cherish, particularly as a scholar myself. So right after undergrad, it was early, my master's degree, we went to Martinique for a conference. I think it was an international literature on Caribbean, international conference on Caribbean literature conference. And on our way there, some of our suitcases were left in Haiti, speaking of which, because I had this car incident this morning, things to happen to me. So, my suitcase was one of the suitcases left in Haiti because it goes from, Air France goes from Haiti to Guadeloupe to Martinique. So when I got to Martinique, I had toiletries, the overhead, but no clothes. And so we have the little money to go and buy, which is like change. just something to wrap around, etc. At any rate, so those of us who did receive a suitcase, they had a meeting and went to meet Aimé Césaire, but as a group, right, of the whole conference, and I didn't know about it. So when I came back, I'm speaking to my peers and my professor, Renée Larrier, she's watching this morning, and they said, well, we went to see Aimé Césaire today, at Fort-de-France, and I was devastated. I said, I didn't get to meet Aimé Césaire. This is just absolutely horrible. And let it pass. That summer, the following summer, that was November, the following summer, there's an institute in Martinique. And of course, I didn't know about it. Someone sent me the email, I applied, and I got in. And my whole focus once I got in was that I have to meet Aimé Césaire. The anecdote will be short, one more minute. And so I get on the plane, and I'm sitting next to this couple that I didn't know was from Martinique. And they happen to be history teachers. But anyway, I'm just lamenting on how I didn't get to see Césaire, and I really want to see him, this time around. And they're like, we'll help you see him. Make a long story short, they worked it out because they know, they have the connections in Martinique at Fort-de-France, and they worked it out to have me meet Césaire individually. Now, it's not the group anymore. It's not a bunch of people and me in the back. It was me and Césaire personally. That was great enough. But when I arrived, who was there is Franck Etienne, who is one of the most renowned Haitian poet, painter, and playwright. So it's almost like a duo. And so years later, when I'm looking at this picture, it's 3 generations. Of course, they're greater, have done greater accomplishment than I have, but 3 generations of scholars, right? And I did not plan any of this. It just so happened that I happened to be in his space. And of course, for me, that interaction with Césaire was not intellectual, it was beyond intellectual. In the tradition of the African kinship, he felt like a grandfather to me, right? This intellectual grandfather. And I recorded it, but lost the video. That's a whole different story. But my professor at that time said, well, perhaps that conversation was for you and him, not to be shared with the public. It's a conversation to be kept in your mind and in your spirit. And I took that wisdom, but now I get to share the pictures that I took with him. And so, that's the segue to my presentation in that this interaction was beyond the intellectual. It was spiritual. I was happy, to be quite honest. I felt like a child. So I was very happy. And so it transcends just the rational, right? The intellect conversations. And so here in the picture, I have sitting again, Franck Etienne, Aimé Césaire, and myself, and this is Franck Etienne, publicist, right? And he's still alive, living in Haiti, right? And by the way, he's one of the, speaking of Franck Etienne, one of the first writers who published in Haitian Creole. So he has plays both in French and in Haitian Creole, and that's why he becomes one of the most renowned figures, because as some of us might know, that the French language is more valued, and for a writer to make that decision, since I think the 1970s, he first published his work in Creole, is very significant. And so going back to Césaire, the importance that Césaire holds in the world in general, but particularly within the Caribbean. So Franck Etienne traveled from Haiti to Martinique to have Césaire sign his book for him. So it's a trip that he made just for that. And I made my trip from the US, and we ended up both in Aimé Césaire's office in 3 generations of scholars. So I'd like to make this a bit higher, the presenter, not the slide, someone can help me, the font, right? I was looking for the word. And so transcendence, I started with my presentation, and at some point I do want to share the quotes with the audience, the quotes from Césaire.
Yes, if you go to the next slide, and then if you,
Okay, so do it that way. All right, perfect. So I start with telling you all that transcendence is one of the key words I associate with Césaire's work and presence. And by presence, I really mean the individual presence, right? The life force of his work, access the intellect of his audience when speaking or when presenting a play, or of his readers when it is about his the written work. And so the subconscious and the unconscious being, the spiritual being, the emotional being, is part of that experience reading his work. And Césaire African-based customs, as practiced in Martinique, coupled with his French education, the intellectual education, tilt him towards the surrealist. And that's why I'm here, the connection between Césaire's work and the surrealist writers and the movement itself. And so this traditional African beliefs, again, it's not straight from Africa, but as it is preserved in Martinique, really emphasize the spiritual, the vegetations, the animal, as one kind for the purpose of the universe. And so in the style of writing, we see his rhythm, and I'm going to show some excerpts of his writing just to give you a visual. The rhythm in his writing really also tilt him towards the surrealist writing style. And also the critical observation of society, right? The critique of society within that style is also crucial. And so surrealism helped him merge the two worlds from which he's from, which is Africa and Europe, and help him more consciously, right? Going beyond the structure, the format that was status quo. And I said more consciously because he was already doing this. And he said in one of his interviews, he gives so many, so then he started to do it more daringly, right? To apply the style, the rhythm, etc., to go outside the formal structure of French poetry. So in his 1967 interview with René Depestre, who is also another poet, playwright, scholar who's now living in the south of France, still alive. So they discussed the interconnection between Négritude, the African diaspora, and also the impact or the influence of Surrealism on Aimé Césaire's work. To quote Aimé Césaire in translation, Surrealism was received as a liberating force, right? If I apply the surrealist approach to my particular situation, which is that of the Afro-Caribbean or French from the colonies of France, Césaire explained, I can summon up those unconscious forces. This, for me, was a callback to Africa. If you remember, I told you earlier just the traditional practices of African beliefs within Martinique. And I call this the poetics of disalienation, right? Reintegrating all of us within our human experiences. And Surrealism was for Césaire another tool to do that, right? This liberating force to do that. Here I mentioned a few of his other influences, among which we have Sédar Senghor from Senegal, Léon Damas from the French Caribbean, all met in Paris, right, during the students' movement. And so Senghor was the most direct and determining influence on Césaire's historical evolution, intellectual evolution, as well as his affective connection to Africa. And I put this in highlight because then that covers the other aspects of the human being, right? The emotions, spiritual, etc. So we have the Surrealism, his encounter with Césaire, Damas, and of course other students in Paris, right, that got together. But also the growing intellectual and cultural awareness of those movements that were taking place in Haiti, in the US, in Cuba, right? If you think of specific places in those countries, Harlem, Havana, Port-au-Prince. Speaking of Harlem, the Renaissance movement, the Harlem Renaissance movement, the 1920s, 30s, and he began to learn about these things while in Paris, right, in the late 1930s, early 40s. And if we think about within the context of Haiti, we have the indigenous movement, which is a cultural and literary movement, right, with the connection of the lifestyle, et cetera. And so all three contributed in his process of desalination in his own writing, in his poetics, if you will, and his poetical content. They led him to plunge into the history and the mysteries of Africa. Here I have a link to the book I published that connects all these movements in cross influences. By that, I mean all the movements within the Caribbean, the US, and also in Africa, but looking at the literary and cultural movements of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, et cetera. So Cahier is the text par excellence where the Surrealist influence meets Césaire historical preoccupations. And I'm gonna pull up the excerpts in a second. So the format of the text appears sometimes in prose, sometimes in poetry format, sometimes in lowercase, uppercase. The repetitions in poetry also accentuate a Caribbean cadence, or cadence, as you pronounce it in English, of a Francophone and Creole rhythm. So to present a text of Césaire written in French into translation doesn't really capture. So I just wanted to show you firsthand in the original form the way it is laid out as its own work, right? So it is the French version that I'm showing you. So if we look here, it's French class. You see the repetition of death continues. And then if you look into, just the rhythm of it, there's a speed to it when you read it, and then it gets longer, it gets shorter, but it is the repetition of words and the repetition of wordplay, right? And I appreciate those who translate his work into English. I've never read his poetry into English because I felt it would be betrayal to my spiritual grandfather. At any rate, so it's just to give you an idea of what the page looks like. And on the other side, if you look towards the bottom, Trésor, Content, la folie, etc. And he continues, and I have another page. And question, rhetorical question, and then he continues to explain his thoughts, and then we see the uppercase, and that happens a lot throughout the text. And here, if it's more into a prose form, on the other side of it, you see that big chunk of text, right? It's not the traditional poetical form. Okay. Again, my apologies for those of you who don't read French, but it was just to give you an idea of the layout of his work, right? So after reading Cahier, I saw that Mr. Tosh went over in one of the series of the ways that Césaire came to meet André Breton, right? He happened to be in Martinique, meaning André Breton, the main figure of the Surrealist movement, happens to be in Martinique on his way to the US. stopped to buy something for his daughter, saw the book, read it, completely impressed, blown away, and asked to meet Césaire. And so after reading this book and his interview or his interactions with Césaire, Breton came to view Césaire as the writer who embodies humanity, guiding us, his contemporary later generations, towards the unexplored. And these are really exactly Breton's word that I paraphrased and translated. But as a scholar, I always want to give my audience the direct source, right? Because you can't trust me, but if you want to see for yourself, right? So that one is expressed in, it's entitled Un Grand Poète, and it is inserted in Césaire Cahier de Retour, right, at the end of the page. And so I also give you part of the French, right, language just to have. And so according to Breton, Césaire expressed in his work, that is, in Cahier and his later work, expressed all the anxieties, all the questions that we have, all the exaltations that we have. And for him, Césaire became an archetype of dignity, integrity, and honesty. And, you know, through many interviews of those who talk about Césaire, you hear that a lot, about his honesty. And one thing that struck me because I mean, if one reads his work, just his gift for the words and for transmitting historical content in poetical form is absolutely impressive. But when one meets him in person, he's very nurturing and calm and honest, right? And so I can see why every other person that has had that interaction with him would describe him in such a way, right? His dignity, his honesty towards people, but also in his work, right? So as Césaire my apologies. As Breton proceeded in his definition or description of Césaire, he describes Cahier as nothing less than the great lyrical monument of this era, right? Of this era in general, right? Regarding whether it's from the Caribbean, Europe, Africa, etc. And quickly, a unique and irreplaceable document, right, as Cahier. And so in the first half, I wanted to focus on what Surrealism meant for Césaire, how the main spokesperson, if you will, of the Surrealist movement sees Césaire and Césaire's work, right, a liberating force as Césaire saw Surrealism, and Breton sees Césaire as one who's bringing us back to humanity and his dignity, et cetera, of the work. And so now I wanted to speak about the Négritude philosophy, right? Because remember, these are the influences of Césaire's work. So with its lyricism, rhythm, imagery, and language, Cahier unveiled the history and the condition of Martinique, right? It was the first declaration of Négritude as a cultural and intellectual philosophy. Négritude was a humanist vocation. It was the beginning of Césaire's international outlook into the Black internationalist tradition. And I say the international outlook because having left Martinique and arrived in France, he had the opportunity to meet various scholars from different countries, right, of different continents. And as a Black internationalist tradition, and I wanted to include that term because it is used a lot, particularly in contemporary scholarship, but it came from Jane Nardal, who is also from Martinique. And so in 1928, she published the essay, L'internationalisme noir, really focusing on world history interconnectedly, transnationally, internationally, et cetera. Césaire goes on to give his first concept of négritude in Cahier. He did that. Haiti, where négritude stood up for the first time and said that it believed in its humanity. And the funny little tale of Florida where Negroes being strangulated in Africa, and he continues. And I show this because it's the opening of outside of Martinique and looking into what's happening in other regions, right, of the world, of the Caribbean in particular. So in his poem entitled Poésie et Connaissance, and it was translated by Professor Arnold into Poetry and Knowledge. And so I was able to bring you Professor Arnold's translation. I'm uncomfortable doing the translations of the poems because they're more, more artistic. The words are different, but the straight essays are easier to accept. And so in the text, Césaire discussed what poetical knowledge is in terms of our life, right? Not just in the work, but in terms of the ways we live our life. So in the essay, I wanted to also bring that up. He introduces excerpts of some of the French writers, the poets that influenced him. Again, remember in the beginning, I said his work, one can see the marriage of these different traditions and influences of Europe and Africa, but also what grew out of Martinique, right? His own personal ways of expressing himself from that culture. And some of the poets that he admires include Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, and Apollinaire. But after doing this, Césaire goes into his perception of the poetic knowledge, what it means. The ground of poetic knowledge as astonishing mobilizing of all human and cosmic forces. It is not merely with his whole soul, it is with his entire being that the poet approaches the poem. What presides over the poem is not the most lucid intelligence or the most acute sensibility, but an entire experience. And he continues, because the image extends inordinately the field of transcendence and the right of transcendence, poetry is always on the road of the truth, right? And so, and that's why I wanted to make it clear, though he's talking about the poem, but he's talking about writing in general and the ways that we live our life, right? And he continued to specify the ground of poetic, the next one. This is the right occasion to recall that the unconscious that all true poetry calls upon is the receptacle of original relationships that bind us to nature. And it was interesting that he says true poetry, right? that emphasis. Within us, all the ages of humankind, within us, animal, vegetable, mineral, mankind is not only mankind, it is universe. Mankind, distracted by its activities, delighted by what it is useful, has lost the sense of fraternity. Right? Delighted by what, I'm repeating purposely, delighted by what is useful has lost the sense of fraternity. And this is from Poetry and Knowledge, if anyone wants to access that. And so my next emphasis is Césaire's call to humanity, really building on his last quote regarding fraternity and humanity, right, in terms of the poetical language. So Césaire's call to humanity. So with the ability to reach the unconscious, true poetry, and I emphasize that, building on Césaire's emphasis, true poetry connects the being to humanity, to fraternity. The call to humanity permeates Césaire's work from the poems in Tropique, which he published between 1941 and 1945, right? And of course, before that, Cahier, which was published in 1939, right? So between Cahier, the poems Intropique, Discourse sur le colonialisme, and the 3 plays that he published in the 1960s, La tragédie du roi Christophe, Une saison au Congo, et Une tempête, all really permeate that quest for humanity and fraternity. But here I wanted to emphasize 3 points tilt Césaire towards the surrealist style and intentions. Styles and social intentions. 1, social observation and criticism, right? And we those of us who are familiar with the surrealist poets are known for that. 2nd, the freedom in rhythm, metaphors, repetitions, juxtapositions, etc., as I showed you previously in the text. In other words, freedom to the poetic language. And 3rd one is recognizing the significance of the subconscious and the unconscious. Right. The subconscious and the unconscious. And it is the subconscious and unconscious that's going to lead his audience, his readers, to self-examination, to self-questioning and self-examination, right? Not just social, but also oneself. Just to list a couple of his work before I get to Discourse, which is the text I wanted to talk a bit more about, and then the 3 plays of the 1960s. And so Les Arts Miraculeuses was published in 1946. That's following that essay delivered in Haiti in 1944. Soleil Coucoupé, 1948, and Discourse sur le colonialisme, 1950. So again, I'm going to show you the page in French before speaking about the text itself, really just to give you the layout and the poetic language in a text that is a prose text, right? It's an essay. So I'm going to walk quickly. Maybe you may not be able to hear me. But if you see the repetition, and I'm going to crever, un accept. Vous faites violer, you see the A repetition, and you see the accept repetition. Right? Accept, continue. And so we see, and if one reads the text, it really does permeate the beat, right? The truthfulness in it, the rhythm, the straightforwardness of it, which I'll discuss, really does capture the reader. And, okay, I'm gonna skip to the next image just to show you. Okay, so here the repetition that those of us who can't read French can follow is that what they say colonialism is and what he says colonialism is, or the truth of colonialism rather. And so that's why we're going to see the repetition on, let me come here. Moi je parle, and he continues. And then the next page I'm going to continue what, as I said before, the misrepresentation of what colonization is and the truth about it. And so he's going to, in this text, is giving an example of what has been happening in this country, right? And so if those have been happening, then they cannot be civilization, right, as colonization is presented to me. And so he continued here with the pour ma part, the first on that side, je parle de million of men, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I'm talking about moi je parle, and you know, as one reads it, the rhythm really is captured. Again, that was just to give you just an idea. And so the text, Discourse, which I just showed you the excerpt, permeates the intellect because it has historical content of the reader, but it also does access human subconscious. It awakens the unconscious thought It awakens the unconscious thought as it brings awareness to practices and behaviors, right? The stuff that we don't think about and you read it, you're like, wow, wow, that's true. And so that's the awakening, une prise de conscience, as we say in French, but the awakening in English of what's taking place. And so it is the text's ability to fully engage, but also transcend, because it takes us beyond our intellectual thought and to our human thought. Not that they cannot be the same, but they're not always the same, right? Take us from there to our humanity, fully engage and transcend the intellect, that Discourse becomes a text of invaluable academic importance. And it is, and I said that somewhere, one of the Césaire's texts that is most read among non-Francophone readers. I think Cahier first, probably in the English department, more literary department, and then Discourse in every department in humanity, yes, in the humanities and social sciences. So the straightforwardness, the poetic that Césaire delivers in Discourse was the culmination of his social observation and honest thought, abbreviated into an article that became the text Discourse sur le colonialisme. And so the way that the text came to exist is that Césaire was invited to submit an article in a journal. And after they contacted him, he said, okay, I'll write the article, but I should be free to speak truthfully, right? Because Césaire doesn't like to not speak truthfully. And so they said, yes, that should be fine. And so that's how Discourse came about. And then in the interview, which I translated, he says, what he wrote, he had been thinking for a long time, what he wrote in Discourse. And that's why I wanted to make the emphasis earlier that if one followed the trajectory of his work, from Cahier to all the plays, at the core of it is that call for humanity and fraternity. And so, so he had been thinking about the content of Discourse for a long time, but this was the first text, besides articles, essays, that was not straight poems, right? So it was the opportunity for him to lay bare the contents he could not have successfully bring across at the National Assembly, because Césaire was elected as mayor of Fort-de-France, and so he attends a lot of the national assemblies discussing conditions and situations in Martinique. And he said what he put in Discourse, even though it addresses the East, mostly Africa, India, etc., but what he put in Discourse is what he could not have said successfully to the National Assembly. So the three plays were published in 1960, La Tragédie du Roi Christophe, 1963, Une saison au Congo, 1966, and Une tempête, 1969. And so we see Césaire go from the poems, as Cahier, Miraculous, etc., to this sort of essay in prose text, the Discourse. And then in the 1960s, he started to publish the plays. That's where he earned the playwright, right, addition to his accomplishment. And these were very successful plays that were performed in Africa, in Europe. And the reason he focused on the plays in the 1960s, well, some of you are in the US, you know the significance of the 1960s. But for him, the 1960s is also important in Africa, right? These are the liberation movements in Africa, right, to gain control back of their individual nations. And so for him, when he presents King Christophe, by the way, I have a short clip at the end. I thought it's always good to give you this visual, right? Because we are, after all, in a museum. So the tragedy of King Christophe, when he presents King Christophe, who presided in Haiti between 1807 to 1820 when he died, and to present Patrice Lumumba in the Congo and the conflict between Lumumba and Mobutu, right? And the corruption and the betrayal that goes into trying to achieve independence. And then in Tempête, which is about language, redoing Caliban and Prospero, but giving the word to the enslaved, if you will. And so, but for him, Christophe and Lumumba surpass their individuality and represent leadership in general. And so he wanted to caution those accessing leadership position to not, to not exploit the masses. In fact, in one of those interviews, when he played it in Africa, La Tragédie de Christophe in both, African dignitaries would get up from the theater and walk away, right? Because again, it's accessing the subconscious and the unconscious and the self-examination. And then they feel, well, he's probably talking to me, or feel a bit defensive, and so would walk away. So the theater is the gift to see, le donner à voir, to see the problems in person. Because again, another reason why he chose theater at that point, because so many of the masses were not literate. And so, but everyone can come and watch a play and get the message without having to read the text. So that was another reason for that. And so de donner à voir, to allow to see and to think, right? To see and to reflect. So that with the plays, the transformative intentions of his work of art were taken to a different dimension, de donner à voir. And so the purpose, quoting Césaire in translation, that was my translation in the literary socio-political writings. And so the purpose of, well, this is my analysis, the next one is Césaire's work. The purpose of a Negro theater for Césaire is to create a space for observation, self-questioning, and examination in order to incite a sense of responsibility within each individual in the community. Again, not just social, but the individual self-examination and responsibility. So now in Césaire's words in my translation, if for a while I have specifically written for the stage, it is because I feel that Africa needs and is thirsty for theater. Theater is an art that is eminently social and directly comprehensible. It was a current theater directly tuned to our problems. The drama must be a conscious awakening. It is de donner à voir and de donner à penser. Right. Okay, so now I come to pulling the clip. Someone is supposed to help me. He's coming. Do you want to blind it first? Okay, it is
this
blinded.
One here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then do that.
Don't start it yet. I
Okay.
could just press play. Okay. So I looked around a lot because I wanted to give that visual. So there are going to be three instances. Again, for those of you who don't speak French, at least, but you can grasp the performance, right? Each of the performers' style, etc. But in the first one, he's speaking to Baron de Vasty, which was like his minister, the next person in line. And Baron criticized them a lot for pushing the people too harsh, the people of Haiti who had just coming out of enslavement, but he's pushing them to still work as hard for the benefit of the nation. Because before, the profit were going to France, and he says, well, now we need to work hard so the profit to build the nation. Of course, these are people tired, right, from centuries of labor. And so they were not content with what they call his tyrannical ways of governing. And so here he's talking to Bastien. He's like, well, you, Mr. the philosopher, because he's a well-educated writer, try to build a nation from scratch and tell me how well you can do. So you help, Monsieur le philosophe. That we can say a lot about the way he's proceeding, but try to be in his place and lead that nation from the very bottom up to the top. So the next one you'll see will be with his wife. You'll see a woman behind the background with the same criticism, if you will, same caution to him that he's pushing the people too hard. And his response to her is that Madam, we have to work hard. Who else in the world has known slavery, has known the life and the plantation, and needs to work from that space up? So therefore, I must push them as hard as possible to build that nation, La Citadelle, and Césaire used the Citadelle as one of which is a real space, but it's really the symbolism of constructing, of building a nation, right? And the third one is him speaking to another leader and say, but that's why the African leaders would walk away. And they said, and criticizing leaders who are replacing the colonialists who are in Africa and say, how good is that for the people if you're continuing to exploit the people the same way the colonialists were exploiting them? And so these are the three instances from that play. Now enjoy the French, enjoy the performance.
Can I just play it and make it full screen?
Yeah, full screen.
On comprendra qu'il n'a plus en face de lui qu'un général rebelle.
Et puis, cela n'a pas d'importance. Si vous voulez une réponse officielle, une réponse noble, comme les aiment nos Solons et nos Lycurgues de Port-au-Prince, dites-leur que je regrette qu'en la circonstance, et par esprit d'animosité contre ma personne, il n'ait pas compris qu'à l'heure actuelle, et au milieu de nos traverses, le plus grand besoin de ce pays, de ce peuple qu'il faut protéger, qu'il faut corriger, qu'il faut éduquer, c'est
La liberté.
La liberté, sans doute, mais pas la liberté facile. Et c'est donc d'avoir un État, oui, monsieur le philosophe, quelque chose grâce à quoi ce peuple de transplantés sans racines boutonne, s'épanouissent, lançant à la face du monde les parfums, les fruits de la floraison. Et pourquoi ne pas le dire, quelque chose qui, au besoin par la force, l'oblige à naître à lui-même et à se dépasser lui-même. À qui fera-t-on croire que tous les hommes, je dis tous, sans privilège, sans particulière exonération, ont connu la traite, la déportation, l'esclavage, le collectif ravalement à la bête, le total outrage, la vaste insulte, que tous, ils ont reçu plaqué sur le corps au visage l'omnignant crachat. Nous seuls, madame, vous m'entendez? Nous seuls les nègres. Alors au fond de la fosse, c'est bien ainsi que je l'entends. Au plus bas de la fosse, c'est là que nous crions, de là que nous aspirons à l'air, à la lumière, au soleil. Et si nous voulons remonter, voyez comme s'impose à nous le pied qui s'arc-boute, le muscle qui s'étend, les dents qui se serrent, la tête. Oh, la tête large et froide.
Ah, il est temps de mettre à la raison ces nègres qui croient que la révolution, ça consiste à prendre la place des Blancs et continuer en lieu et place, je veux dire sur le dos des nègres, à faire le blanc.
Help. You know, on Facebook, you never know what's going to come up for next. Let's stop.
Next video over here.
No, yeah, we can stop. Yeah, we can stop here. And so just to, the main writer, the one who plays King Christophe, is actually a Senegalese actor, right, who plays the Haitian leader.
Was that ever done in Creole?
Well, there are different versions that are done that try to build on that or repeat it. but they're done with different performers. And so again, I don't think they measure up to this, right, to the original one, but they do have different ones in French as well. They have those of them taking place in France with different Caribbean actors, and so there's been so many versions of it, and it's been difficult to find the original one. I did see the original one at Rutgers. My professor had it. I think it was in VHS at one of our libraries, so I was able to see the whole play. But since then, I haven't been able to find it. So perhaps it just stays within the academic realm, but just certain universities hold it. Yeah. And quickly, there's one, and then we can go on. One part, because I wasn't sure of how much time I will have, the painter Wilfredo Lam, that also was mentioned last time, similar to Césaire, and Césaire, discovered Africa through Senghor, giving him their historical content, and then he passed it on to Wilfredo Lam, who was living in Europe at a very young age, and even though he was from Cuba, Afro-Cuban, his art was merely surrealist and sort of abstract, which he continued, but he also then, after meeting Césaire, have this this consciousness, right, of what's taking place of Africa and not just the stereotypes of what he hears in Europe. And so Césaire, it's interesting that Wilfredo Lam's painting is called The Jungle, and then Césaire playing on the word in Africa. He's like, since then, Wilfredo Lam just can't stop doing the jungle, etc. And that's another thing about Césaire, his humor, his calm nature, but also his humor. I'm still here. Yes, please. Okay, so that completes my talk on Césaire. And just as an overview, just to bring you all back together, I started with the Surrealist movement as it relates to this museum and the Surrealist painters and poets and writers, right? And André Breton as one as the lead Surrealist, and his encounter with Césaire in Martinique, and his impression of Cahier, his impression of Césaire, and the forces that connect Césaire to surrealism, right? The subconscious, the unconscious, and social observation and self-examination through the unconscious and subconscious, and how that plays out in Césaire's work throughout the years, right? From Cahier to all the plays that, my apologies, all the poems that he published, to Discourse sur le colonialisme, which is a text in prose, and to the 1960s. Again, why the plays are important, again, we go back to the call to humanity and fraternity, but to go away from the exploitation of the masses, of self-examination and questioning of not just society, but of oneself, because if each individual is able to do that, then it becomes better for society. And so this is it. Thank you for the museum. Thank you for the audience. I know it's been a crazy morning for me, to say the least. Thank you for sticking around and have that moment.